Welcome to George Mason University's Studio A. My name is Rick Davis, and today our guest is Ann Hornaday, film critic for the Washington Post. Please welcome Ann Hornaday. Thanks for being here, Ann.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We're especially pleased to have you because you're the first critic who has graced our repertoire of Studio A episodes.
Oh, goodness.
And I think it's important to hear that voice
It's an honor.
in this industry. How did you get started as a film critic? What's your background?
Well, probably like many film critics, totally by accident. I started out as a freelance writer in New York City. I actually started out at Ms. Magazine as a fact checker. And knew all along that I wanted to be a journalist. And very shortly after getting to Ms., went freelance. And it was back in the days when they had rents that, you know, one could afford and actually be a freelance writer for a few years while one found one's way, which is what I did. And I wrote about lots of subjects for lots of magazines and some daily papers, some daily news stories and things like that. And along the way, began writing for Premiere Magazine, which was just then getting off the ground. It was that would have been probably in '88.
Yep.
And eventually ended up pitching a story to the New York Times Arts and Leisure section about a documentary called Brother's Keeper, done by Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. And that really that was a tipping point in terms of starting to get kind of a specialty in film writing. But of course those were features, not reviews.
Yeah.
And I got a film critic's job at the American Statesman in Austin, Texas.
So you picked up from New York? And
Exactly, moved to Austin, which was
a
a long time goal of mine, having visited Austin and having fallen in love with it.
Yeah.
I knew I would, you know, when they called, I was thrilled, you know, to have a chance to live down there. And they had a burgeoning film scene. Of course, Rick Linklater lives down there and had been doing Slacker and Dazed and Confused. Robert Rodriguez was starting to make films. Mike Judge was starting to get on the scene, and they were also inviting lots of Hollywood feature films to be filmed there. So they wanted a writer who could report on that film culture and the production scene as well as write reviews. So I was probably hired at the Statesman more on the strength of my reporting than the criticism.
Did you prepare to be a film critic at all, like in school, or was
No,
it just...
no, I didn't. I mean, I had not been a film buff growing up. When I was in college, I majored in government, political theory. You know, always, you know, don't do as I do, do as I do. So really, the best preparation I had was a liberal arts education and a real generalist's appetite for all things cultural.
Yeah.
And also just being a voracious reader. And I still think the writing, I got in it because of the writing, if you know, not because of the films. And that's still the most important thing to me is the quality of
Criticism
the writing.
is an art form itself, after all.
I'd like to think so.
What brought you to the Post?
Well, that's a funny story. When I was very happy in Austin and loved living there and loved working there. And then a guy named Stephen Hunter, who had been working at the Baltimore Sun, took a job as the critic at the Washington Post. And the Sun called me to be his replacement in Baltimore. And at that point, you know, the Baltimore Sun is a storied newspaper with a wonderful history. And at that point was being edited by John Carroll and Bill Marimo and a terrific team of editors and leaders, and they were really committed to narrative journalism and clearly had a love of writing and wanted to nurture writers in a way that I thought I just couldn't pass up that opportunity. So I picked up again and moved to Baltimore and spent many happy years at the Baltimore Sun, maybe 2 or 3 actually, and then left there to write a book. I think I was probably a little bit burned out and wanted a break from the grind of going to screenings 2 or 3 nights a week. And wrote a book proposal, and that took exactly a year, and exactly a year later the Post called for me to fill in temporarily for someone who was going on fellowship, and guess what? I'm still there.
Was it a book on film? Or
Yeah, it was about a movie called Sweet Smell of Success with Burt Lancaster and Tony Curtis, which is a weird little sort of semi-film noir. Clifford Odets wrote it. It's about a publicist and a vicious columnist in New York, and it's sort of a cult favorite, and it's got kind of an interesting production story. And unfortunately, I couldn't interest a publisher in that particular project, but maybe there will be a life for that someday.
Well, off screen, we'll talk about Clifford Odets, because he's
I'd
one
love
of my
to.
favorite
Yeah,
playwrights.
it's a great story.
Let me ask you about your process for writing a review. You obviously see the film as the first thing, but is there background research that goes into it, or does that come after the fact, or do you just sit down and do it?
Well, you know, it's sort of different for every case. I think in the case of today, as we speak, Roman Polanski has a new movie out, and now with somebody like him, he tends to revisit themes throughout the movies, throughout his career, and I think it behooves a critic to know about that. And if one is not acquainted with the filmmaker's work, it probably makes sense to get acquainted with the filmmaker's work. And since I am coming at this not as a film buff, there have been lots of cases, and I still feel like I'm always educating myself in terms of particular directors' bodies of work. If it's based on a true story, for example, I think, in a way, it probably is better to do that research after you see the film, just because I think it's only fair to see a film fresh, with as little amount of baggage as one can.
Like the audience will?
Exactly, exactly. And if there are holes that are, if there are holes or there are lingering questions, then the readers deserve to know that.
Are you at all interested in what other critics are writing?
No, as a matter of fact, I'm very, I'm probably over scrupulous about avoiding other critics' work, which breaks my, because other critics are some of my favorite writers, just as writers, and I miss it. I mean, I love reading Anthony Lane in the New Yorker. I love reading Tony Scott's work in the New York Times, but honestly, I don't let myself. Because I don't want to be necessarily contaminated by other people's opinions or swayed, and also there's just this sort of lingering paranoia about picking up words or ideas in the ether, and somehow appropriating them, and I just don't.
Unconscious plagiarism.
Yeah, I'd rather avoid that.
But you mentioned other critics. Do you, when you go and see a screening, is it a screening with a bunch of other critics in the room, or
Often,
is it
yes.
Is that an artificial situation, or how does that feel?
No, it feels pretty collegial. I mean, it really varies. I mean, in some cases, we'll be sitting together in a screening room, often at the MPA in Washington. A very collegial group of local and regional critics there. Sometimes we'll see them in an evening preview screening, usually on a Tuesday night, usually at a movie theater like everybody else goes to, and it's usually with an audience. And I think that's the best.
With an audience, okay.
Yeah, and it's often people that have won tickets at a radio giveaway, or they've been sent, they've gotten tickets through some other means, but you're seeing it with a quote unquote real audience. That's particularly helpful with comedies. I mean, I think that seeing a comedy all by yourself or with a few sort of, tired, cynical critics isn't exactly the most fair way to see one. And then sometimes I do end up seeing things on screeners, on DVDs that are sent to my home. And that's probably the least preferable way, just because I feel like if a filmmaker goes to the trouble to make a movie, the least I can do is see it on the screen, on the size screen, and in the context in which, it was meant to be made.
Yeah. This is a big question, but let's see if we can work through it. You now are obviously fluent in the language of cinema, and you've reviewed, I don't know, hundreds of films, if not thousands.
Probably.
What do you think makes for a good film? Is there some secret? Is there some common theme that you look for?
It's something it's a big question. You're right, and it's a mystery I'm still trying to solve. And more, I've become convinced that it's an issue of tone. That I think directors, they're responsible for so many decisions. I mean, they're responsible for choosing the project and the script, and then casting it and making all the myriad decisions that go into creating a set and what you see on the screen, what you hear on the screen, and then what that all equals is a sense of tone. And I also really look for a visual language. I just think that more and more, I think with the advent of video and DVD and now iPods and the screens have gotten smaller and smaller, and one of the sort of sad consequences of that is that commercial films are made for those size screens, and so we often see films that are just no more than close-ups of people talking to each other, and it goes from cut to cut to cut to cut, and there's nothing really inherently visual or dynamic in the image. So what I look for in a film is something that's dynamic and cinematic and really is using the full visual language.
We have a clip, a couple minutes, of a film called There Will Be Blood, which you have identified as as one that shows us some of these features. Let's watch a couple minutes of this one, and then we'll talk about it.
Lights out! Wait here, wait here. Lights
there's an awful lot to notice in that clip. Beautiful filmmaking. What strikes your practiced eye?
Oh, everything. I mean, it's such a densely layered piece of cinema in terms of the way that it's Paul Thomas Anderson is the director, and the way he just layers the scene visually with the horizontal camera movement, you know, when you're tracking behind Daniel Day-Lewis as he's running to the rig, and then the gusher going up. I mean, there's this wonderful kind of right angle there visually. And then that whole sound design. Johnny Greenwood did the music for this film, and he was robbed of an Oscar nomination even, let alone a win for that score. But then just the way he layers on, not just the percussive beats that you hear toward the end, but the silences, you know.
Yeah. What struck me was when we went to the shot of the young boy who we find out in a minute has just lost his hearing.
Right.
We're in a whole other sonic world.
It's incredible. I mean, and he used silence beautifully earlier in that first opening sequence of the movie. Is I think almost a 20 minutes, almost completely silent, meaning wordless, but it's just, again, very layered in terms of the sound design, a very sophisticated
And so
use.
tone, when you use the word tone, what kind of tone does this movie
You know, it's
create?
I guess it's epic is such an overused term, but he creates a world, you know, he plunges the viewer into this world, and he never breaks. And the funny thing about this film is that it has sort of this weird third act, you know, that does break with the tone, where he changes the time period and he really changes the emotional charge. And Lewis's character, who's been sort of ambiguous really up until then, not particularly likable, but he has his strengths, but by that time he's really become quite a monster. And it really goes into this kind of grotesque area, which I think was a tonal break and maybe a flaw, but I liked it because it was a bold, I don't know, it worked for me in the context of, I think, of what he was trying to say about the American trajectory and the American experience.
Oh, great, that's terrific. We got a lot out of that 2 minutes there.
Good.
That's great. We have, I know, some questions from our studio audience, so let's turn to them. Hi.
Hi, my name is Alex. What's it like working for the Washington Post?
Well, it's a thrill. I won't lie. I get very sentimental about it. I don't know about you, but I'm sure you didn't grow up with it, but I did grow up with a movie called All the President's Men. And it's still one of my all-time favorite movies. And there is still a sense when you walk in there of walking into that newsroom. You know, I mean, it does, the newsroom where I work still kind of evokes that era, the 70s era of the Watergate reporting.
They're not smoking anymore.
No, it's not that haze of fog. Although I don't know what's in some of those desk drawers. There might be a pint of something hidden in there. But it's a wonderful group of people. They take journalism very seriously. They take writing, the beauty of the word very seriously. And it's an incredibly smart, supportive group of reporters and editors. And it's a huge privilege to work there.
Great. Anybody else? Yes. Hi.
Hi, I'm Kwanzaa. If you could change anything in the film industry, what would it be?
I think it would be cravenness. It would be fear. You know, it's a very fear-based industry. They, and you know, again, it's, and this sort of is a function of its being more corporatized. I mean, I think more and more studios are subsidiaries of larger corporations that are beholden to their shareholders, meaning they're beholden to a quarterly earnings report, meaning they cannot lose money, meaning they don't want any accidents. They're very risk averse. And so that's why we see so many films that are based on comic books or pre-sold hit books or TV series. I mean, these are called pre-sold properties where they're basically guaranteed an audience. And they tend to be like the movies I was talking about before, you know, unimaginative, not particularly cinematic, but they know they're going to get the tushies in the seats because they know that people before have loved these properties. So, I mean, the one thing that does dismay me a little bit is just how, but I mean, I don't know how, it's easy to kind of look back fondly on an era like the 70s and say, oh, but they were so much more risk-taking then, but I'm not sure, you know, what amazes me is how many good movies still do come out of that system, so.
Yeah. Who's next? Hi.
Hi, my name is Victoria. Do you have any advice for future film critics?
You know, at this point in the media culture, I'm not sure I do. We're really in a state of flux right now, and hundreds of film critics at daily papers have lost their jobs over the last few years. I'm extremely lucky to have a job in daily journalism. I came of age and I developed my career way long before the blogs and the internet and things like that. So I'm not sure exactly, I would say the most important thing about being a critic, any kind of critic, is developing your voice and finding your voice. And toward that end, I think a blog would be great. I mean, I think it's a terrific way to just write every day, or just get yourself into that disciplined habit of writing and seeing and noticing and honing that voice, and then hoping that somebody sees it. I mean, that's the piece I'm not exactly sure where that goes, and if you can make a living at it. So I'm not exactly sure I'm the right person to even ask at this point. But
Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Erin, and I was wondering if there's ever been a film you've reviewed that you regret not giving enough consideration to.
Yeah, there were two that come to mind. Both I saw they were both when I was in Austin. One was Dead Man by Jim Jarmusch, which is this weird revisionist Western that he did with Johnny Depp, and Billy Bob Thornton was in it, and Robert Mitchum was in it. I mean, it was just it was a beautiful, visually beautiful black and white picture, and I just didn't get it at the time, and I probably wrote.
I didn't get it either.
Okay, thank you. Please join me. And it was one of those cases where I went back to see it for some reason. I saw it again, and I realized, I loved it. I just loved the weirdness of it, and I think I was just, I don't know if it's because my expectations were more properly managed. And the same thing happened with Office Space, the Mike Judge movie, and it just breaks my heart that I didn't just jump up and down and do handsprings when I saw it, but it didn't hit me that way. And of course now it's become such a huge cult hit, and deservedly so, and I'm a big fan of his, so anyway, mea culpa. There's always the chance, the latest one of those cases, I have a feeling might be Shutter Island, this new Scorsese picture, which I didn't like at all, and it's been one of those very polarizing films. If you've noticed the reviews, they're either love or hate, and I have this sneaking suspicion, like, oh please Lord, don't let me go back and think, oh, I missed the whole point, so we'll see.
We have time for one more student question, I think.
Hi, my name is Young. What are some of the best and worst movies you've seen, and why?
Maybe one of each.
Oh, one of each.
Can you do one of each?
We could go recent. I love Observe and Report was definitely a huge disappointment lately. I wasn't a big fan of Orphan, the horror movie. I just thought, and it's not just because. I think that Gothic horror is a really hard thing to get right, and it can go into the torture porn, genre so easily, and I think it slipped into that. The best, I will say again, I'm a huge fan of The Hurt Locker. I saw that about a year and a half ago at the Toronto Film Festival, and it was at the very end of that festival, which is usually when you're really burned out and you kind of don't want to see another movie. You're not sure you're going to appreciate it, and it just blew my socks off, and I'm just thrilled for Catherine Bigelow that it's getting the recognition it deserves right now with so many Oscar nominations, and again a great use of that cinematic grammar that I was talking about earlier in terms of really telling a story through movement and behavior and visual and sonic cues more than just talk dialogue, expository dialogue.
You mentioned Shutter Island and the fact that it's been a polarizing movie in the marketplace, in the critical marketplace. Could you spend a little time with that idea? I mean, this idea of this movie that was very heavily hyped. It's got an all-star production team and cast and everything, and it has gotten some raves.
Yes.
But also some serious pans, including from you. What about it didn't reach its potential or work for you?
For me, I think it was, and I adore Martin Scorsese, and I think he's a hero in terms of what he's done for film preservation and education in this country about the history of cinema and its roots, and knowing what you're seeing when you see a contemporary film and how it reaches back to a much longer tradition. But I think that sometimes that can, in this case, it got the better of him in terms of it's very much an homage to Alfred Hitchcock. It's very much an homage to filmmakers like Samuel Fuller, whom I know that he loves, and Otto Preminger. But I think those references sometimes I think they're kind of literally realized without advancing them in his own way, so that it becomes kind of a series of references more than a really involving story. And again, getting back to that tonal issue, I think it pulls you out of the movie, you know, and it pulls you out of the world that he's trying to create, so that we should be in. We should be in this psychological environment of ambiguity and paranoia and not sure what's right or wrong. And I'm not. I just feel like the obvious references really took me out of
that's
that.
very interesting and insightful. Now I haven't seen the movie yet, so I don't know how insightful that. But just it feels like I'm now going to watch the movie with a more interesting frame of reference.
Okay, I just again though
thanks
I
to
don't.
that.
You know, you do. It is. I think that it is subjective. I mean, I think
Yeah.
there are objective things that make a movie good, but then there are subjective ways of deciding if they've been
Yeah.
achieved.
And then there are times when you just out and out love a movie.
Right.
And with your permission, I'm going to read one of your most laudatory reviews.
Okay.
This is for Star Trek. Let us pray. Lord of Star Trek and its many spin-offs, we thank thee for a movie that, against all odds, has miraculously resurrected a wheezing but beloved and still relevant franchise. We thank thee for an origin story that, unlike such recent downers featuring the Incredible Hulk and Wolverine, pays affectionate respect to its source material, but never falls into slavish worship or worse, self-seriousness. Instead, viewers have been blessed with a movie that retains a warm and playful spirit, even when one of its chief protagonists is being chased by a lobster-red monster or an intergalactic tundra, or fending off tattooed, time-traveling space pirates aboard a huge, fire-spewing drill. And I'm going to cut ahead to the end here. Lord, we thank thee for imbuing Abrams, J.J. Abrams, imbuing Abrams with taste and conscience enough to guarantee that Star Trek will once again live long and prosper. May he do the same. Amen. That's the most unqualified rave I've ever read of a movie, and it's wonderful.
liked it.
It's wonderful. So that's the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. Well, it's always such a relief, you know, and especially as I said before, as loath as I am to accept these sequels, these endless sequels and franchises, when somebody does it right, it's an added relief, especially with a material as beloved as Star Trek. And this was, of course, the reboot and the prequel, which is so fraught with danger and terror.
Yeah.
And he did pull it off so gracefully and well. And the actors were also terrific
Yeah,
too.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so I mean, it was just,
yeah.
I'm not a Trekkie myself, but I'm married. I don't know if I could qualify my husband as a Trekkie, but I know and love them, and I knew that it mattered, so I
Yeah.
tried to kind of write in that spirit.
Have you ever taken on a sort of a voice like that before? In any
No,
other-
that was
yeah.
brand new. I mean, I wouldn't ever abuse that privilege, and I even felt, you know, a little bit odd about doing it and that, but it just, you know, it felt like the right thing to do at the time. So once in a while, you know, if it feels like that's the way to go, you do it, but then you can never do it again.
And I understand that Mr. Abrams actually wrote to you.
Yeah, he wrote me an email that day. It was very funny. It was like a one-line email saying, that's the best review I've read all day.
Yeah,
I think he really,
probably all year.
I mean, I think, yeah, maybe, I don't know.
That's wonderful. Here's another one of those big questions, philosophical type questions. Critics obviously have a role to play in the marketplace, also in the culture at large. What do you think that role is? Why do we continue to value criticism?
Well, I hope we continue to, you know, personally. I mean,
Let's
and,
just take
and
it as a
not
given
just in
that we do.
self-interest. I hope you're right. Well, I think that increasingly we are living in a visual age, and a media saturated age with YouTube and Hulu and, you know, not just the movies, but we're surrounded by screens and images on them, and we need to know how to decode those images, and we need to know how to, you know, mediate them for ourselves. So I think that the critic's job isn't so much to say good or bad or thumbs up or thumbs down, but just to give consumers and viewers and readers the tools that they need to kind of navigate this increasingly supersaturated world. I mean, when I first started writing reviews, it was when I was going to Austin. A dear friend who had been a television critic at the Philadelphia Daily News gave me the best advice that I've ever had, and he said, you know, when you go to write a review, just ask. And apparently, this started with Goethe, no less. Yeah. But he said, ask yourself 3 questions: what is the artist, in this case, filmmaker, trying to achieve? Did he or she achieve it, and was it worth doing?
Absolutely.
And honestly, that's really how I try to approach every review, because it takes it out of that realm of pure subjective, I liked it or I didn't, because that's frankly not that helpful,
yeah,
you know, to people
exactly.
who might like it. You know, you have to judge a work on its own terms. And
help the audience understand those
and
terms.
help them understand that those terms, whatever context, and then ascertain whether it succeeded.
I have time for only one more quick question. That is, given all of that, I think that's a very inspiring way to look at criticism. do the stars bother you? The 3 stars, the 4 stars, the thumbs up, the thumbs down?
Yeah, I mean, there's no, they are an occupational, they're just a necessary evil, I guess. And the Post, to its credit, resisted them for many, many,
Yeah.
many, many years. But again, that is very much a function of the web, and it's a function of what we're trying to do in terms of being of service to our
Sort of
readers.
the quick hit.
That's
Yeah.
what it's all about. So I think you just have to kind of accept it and try to make the best of it.
Well, Ann Hornaday, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you for
Thank
being
you.
with us today.
It's a pleasure for
I'm
me.
Rick Davis. This is Studio A. Thanks for watching.